Now we move into Standard 6. Standard 6, we look at the 1920s, the Great Depression, and New Deal. So we'll start with the 1920s, and that's Standard 6.1. We're going to look at the impact of the changes in the 1920s and those changes on the economy, society, culture. We're talking about the expansion of mass production, how we start producing a lot more products. We're going to talk about new home appliances and introduction of the installment plan. We're going to talk about the role of transportation in changing urban life, the effect of the radio and movies in creating a national mass culture, and the cultural changes that were exemplified by the Harlem Renaissance. So to get started, after World War I, the United States entered a period of economic growth and cultural change that had both positive and negative consequences. There's an economic boom that happens after the war. And we think that all Americans are doing better in the 1920s, but in reality, not everyone is doing better. There were higher wages and higher standard of living and high employment. However, the expansion of economic opportunities didn't extend to all Americans, like farmers or African Americans, or workers even. The economic boom in the 1920s had negative consequences for some segments of the economy. For one example is the coal industry. The coal industry, they lost their jobs because of the increased electric energy field. And so that really hurt the coal industry a lot. And so the depression started for them a lot earlier than the rest of the nation. Farmers are another good example. The farmers suffered economic depression when the end of World War I brought a loss in markets. They had been supplying a lot of goods over to Europe. And so whenever World War I came to an end, they stopped being able to sell those goods to Europe. And so that's going to lead to surpluses of crops, and that would lead to low prices and foreclosures. So remember, it's the same problem that they had before. They were producing too much. And when they started producing too much, the prices started falling. And so then they decided, well, I'm going to produce more. And the prices kept falling. And so farmers actually start the Great Depression a little bit early. There were also mass production techniques, like the assembly line that Henry Ford created. And it helps be able to create a lot of new products. They use it for radios, refrigerators, and many other new products. The problem is it's going to marginalize the skilled worker. It doesn't take a lot of skill to work on an assembly line. You learn one specific task, and that's what you do all day. It does lead to good things, new innovation, new products, but it does hurt the skilled worker a little bit. Here are some examples of pictures of the assembly line, and that's Henry Ford's assembly line. Workers were still vastly underpaid, and labor unions were unable to protect their members because there were a lot of anti-union attitudes. And so there's going to be this big gap between the haves and the have-nots, and the rich are going to get richer while the poor is going to get poorer, and that's going to be a big cause of the Great Depression. The media is going to make things even worse because they're going to show all these advertising of goods, and a lot of workers can't afford to buy them, but they see ads for them, so they want to buy them. If you couldn't afford to buy a product, you saved until you could. So they create what's called the installment plan, which is this idea that you buy now and pay later. So it's credit. It's not a credit card like we think of today, but it is credit the same as, similar to a credit card. This stimulates the economy because people are buying all those appliances and cars even if they can't afford it, and so that's giving people jobs. The only problem is going to happen when they can't pay it back, and they're going to reach a point where they're not going to be able to repay it because they're going to owe more than what they actually bring in. The new home appliances did lead to some social change for women. They were able to do their household chores more quickly because of these new products like washing machines and electric irons and vacuum cleaners. A lot of working class women couldn't afford those appliances, so it really only applied to mostly the middle class. And they actually, middle class women could do their own chores themselves because it was quicker and easier, and so they didn't have to hire a housekeeper, which again is going to hurt the lower class working women because there's going to be less jobs for them. So electrical appliances, they led to no significant decrease in household chores or to changes in women's position in society. They still were considered to be about the same as they were before. Housework was quicker and easier, but you still had the same amount of work to get done. Here's some examples of some of the appliances that were made back then. You see the radio, the telephone, the boombox, the phonograph, the washing machine, the typewriter. There's a refrigerator, there's a heater and a toaster, coffee pot, a stove, and a toaster. Here's another couple pictures of a stove and an iron and a toaster, and imagine actually trying to do stuff using those products. But at the time, these products were revolutionary because before that, they didn't have any of these things to make household chores easier. And so it's really going to significantly impact life at home. And the people that couldn't afford it, they're going to want to buy those. And so they will use credit to be able to afford to buy those products. Another important concept in the 1920s is the flapper. This is a woman. She's kind of like the embodiment of female freedom, and they were named that way because of the way they dressed. It was a very small portion of the female population at the time. But it's going to help change some cultural attitudes toward women. Most women continued to be the traditional roles of wife and mother, and it didn't change that much. But but just this idea that women could dress differently and act differently helps lead to some change in the attitude towards women. The flapper was really a creation of the advertisement industry, and I'll show you some pictures of what a flapper was. Here's an example of a flapper right here. You can see like a very big change in dress. Really, women went from wearing dresses that were to their ankles to up to closer to their knees. And so that's a big change in attitudes. And there were also some other attitudes associated with these women. One had to do with like drinking in public and smoking in public and acting more like men were supposed to act. Advertising, radio, and the movies spread this mass consumer culture. At the same time, it reinforced a lot of traditional gender roles. So you did have some flappers, but really most women that were portrayed as wives and mothers. And they made formerly luxury items into necessities like cars, Lysol, soap, cake mixes, washing machines, and irons, where everybody wants to have those. Here's just an example of an ad at the time where everybody wants to buy Listerine, and so everybody will spend money to be able to buy Listerine and borrow money if that's what it takes. Transportation has a huge impact on urban life. Just think about how transportation has an impact on our own lives. Can you imagine trying to date someone and not having a car? It would be pretty tough. So the car is really important, and it changes the way some people live. It leads to the creation of suburbs, although not very many people are moving to suburbs yet. But if you could afford a car, then you could afford to live outside of the city. And so what happens is you have some of the richer people start to move outside of the city, which is going to leave some of the poor people left in the city. That's going to change a little. That's going to be more prevalent later in the 1950s. That's going to be a much bigger deal. It also changed the lives of rural Americans because they're able to get to town more easily, and they're able to go and socialize and market their crops. And so the car has a tremendous impact. I just think about my own life getting my first car and how big of an impact that car had on my life. And I'm sure most of you could probably agree with me, whether you have a car or not. Aviation was not really that important to the 1920s. You do have some of the first flights that happen, and it was exciting, and it doesn't have a big impact on the average American. Some ways the planes were used were through like the post office to deliver mail, but otherwise there's really little use of the airplane in civilian life after World War I. It's going to take World War II before airplanes are really going to be more part of society. But they still thought it very exciting, and some of the most famous people in the 1920s were aviators, like Amelia Earhart and Charles Lindbergh, who's pictured right here. During this time period, African Americans start migrating in great numbers to segregated neighborhoods and cities in the Northeast and Midwest. They moved there because, one, to find jobs, and two, to get away from the Jim Crow discrimination that was going on in the South, all the violence and poverty in the South. So that's going to help pull them to the North to try to find jobs. And this was what was called the Great Migration. As they moved up north, they started to move into cities that were segregated, like Harlem, for instance. And they started congregating those neighborhoods. And there's going to be a big growth of African American writers, musicians, and artists. And that's going to be what's called the Harlem Renaissance, where they're going to bring recognition and pride to black artists. And here's a couple of examples of some paintings at the time. Writers of the Harlem Renaissance included James Weldon Johnson and Langston Hughes, and they celebrated their ties to African cultural traditions and black pride and questioned the position of African Americans in American life. If you've read any of Langston Hughes' work or James Weldon Johnson's work, you can see that. I fixed the slide so you could see the bottom of it and corrected how Langston Hughes' name was spelled. All right, so as as the Harlem Renaissance goes on, the radio was so prevalent in society that it was all this new big invention. Everybody had to have a radio. Well, that's going to help spread the appreciation for new trends in music, such as jazz, towards the white audience, and it's going to help promote a shared national culture. African Americans, however, are still mostly portrayed as racial stereotypes. There's a really famous early film called Birth of a Nation that really showed like the resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan, and it was very, very negative towards African Americans, and really showed how discrimination against African Americans continued. Here's another example of a painting that would have been famous during the Harlem Renaissance, just showing how African Americans are trying to get out of the fields, get out of being in bondage, and move towards the city. And so that's a good way to end this. If you haven't already, please go and turn in the notes guide and take the video quiz. Thank you.